right, hello everyone, and welcome to this month's episode of Wheel Tapping, number 11. Tony, can you believe we are closing out the year? Like, we've been doing this a year. Is that surprising to you?
Yes, it is. It is. Wait, but is this number 12? My notes say 12.
Well, I think you keep counting the COVID special as one, where I count that as a special episode. So this is the 12th month. This is our 12th show, which is kind of, amazing. But just real quick, I'm going to take care of some business up front. Number one is that next month, coming up, well, actually to be in the middle of August, let me look at the calendar because I'm a horrible person and I don't remember. We will be doing Wheel Tapping Live, which what we're going to do is we are actually going to stream at Capstone Games, and we're going to cover the Iron Rail series, which is kind of exciting. And yes, Clay might have something to announce there. So people who love the series and might be hankering for more might want to come to that and check it out. We will release it in our normal podcast feed and as a normal show after the fact. But if you want to catch it live and possibly interact with us directly and ask any questions that we can answer, check it out then. So that's going on to Camp Capstone.
So will that be 12 or is that?
that will be 12. That will be official episode 12. If we didn't, yeah, it's kind of our anniversary celebration. We were thinking of doing something special, and I think the Iron Rails will make an Iron Rail. I keep adding an S. Will make a very interesting discussion, and that will be on the 15th. So check out Capstone Games, capstonegames.com/Discord. We'll get you the schedule of everything. So we're looking forward to that. I think that'll be pretty cool, and I'm a little excited because Camp Capstone.
Yeah, for sure, man.
I love heavy games. So just up front, let you know what's going on with that. But today we are going to be talking about 1826, which I just happened to win the other night, so I was kind of excited with that. More on that later, because it kind of is counter to some of Tony's points that we'll have an interesting, lively discussion about.
Absolutely.
And we thought it would be good. We kind of seem to have this tradition now of actually getting the designers on. So we have via phone. He actually ended up calling in with a video link too. So we kind of have a little bit of both. We have Mr. David Hecht, the designer of 1826, to join us. How are you doing today, David?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm outstanding. I'm excited. You're one of my favorite designers. I mean, Scan's sitting literally right back here behind me. So I enjoy your games a lot. Our brains are similar. So I'm excited to see what we get to talk about today. Let's kind of dive right into this. So 1826 was published initially by Chris Lawson in 2000, and then again in Deep Thought Games in 2004. So I need to ask the question, as I've been around this a long time, but is this the Lawson that we get Lawson Track from?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So now I need to.
Chris published 3 other games, and he offered to publish 1826 if I ever, got it into a publishable state. And it took quite a long time for that to happen, but I won't bore you with all that. And because I started fooling around with this back in 1995, back when I went to a Railcon in. I'm gonna say I think it was in Lancaster, but because we talked about that a little earlier, and I'm actually, now that I'm thinking about it carefully, I'm pretty sure that this is a Railcon, not an actual Origins or of course WBC, which didn't come around until several years later. But they invited Federico Villani, right, the designer of 1841 and 1849. I guess one should say co-designer, since technically Manlio Manzini co-designed on 1841, at least. I'm not sure about 1849. And I said, gee, it's such an interesting thing. And, and bear in mind, in those days, there were maybe a half a dozen games that you could play. Oh yeah, you should definitely try designing a game, because why not? I can design a game and I'm just an engineer. So what do I know? that's when I started designing 1826. So anyhow, by way of a long segue to get back to Chris Lawson saying that he would publish it if it ever came to fruition, which he was kind enough to do. And then, I was looking for a way to easily distinguish the John Tamplin version from the Chris Lawson version, other than putting it in those terms. And so I came up with the idea. We're going to publish it in 2004. It suddenly occurred to me, it's the I don't want to say bêtise here. It's the 60th anniversary of of Normandy and of the liberation. So if you read the passage carefully where I talk about why I called it the Liberation Edition, you'll observe that it says something about it commemorates an era when the United States put together a coalition of more than 30 countries dedicated to the proposition that people enslaved by another country's occupation should be made free, or words to that effect. I don't have the exact document in front of me. And that was intended in large measure to frame what I was saying in terms of historical context. Maybe people, especially British people, might have a greater appreciation for.
So we get it published. You get it published by both people. We're able to get the new edition. What really changed between the 2000 to 2004? Like, what's the highlight reel of any big changes?
There were no significant changes. A lot of it was just graphical facelift and incorporation of some of the errata that had come up in between time. In fact, if you go to the 1826 page on Board Game Geek, you'll find that there's in the downloadable files, there is in fact a file that talks about this very thing.
Okay, great. That's awesome. I was like wondering if Paris was ever a through city in the old version, and now all of a sudden we're playing with the chopped down version.
it would never have been. It would never have been because it never was, and for that matter, it still never is. It still isn't.
Right.
I mean, about 10 or 20 years ago, the French rail system, the SNCF, started instituting using the TGV. They instituted what they called relation province-province, which is to say connections between the provinces, the outlying areas of France, and those were in fact specifically routes that went from north to south without going through Paris, because there was a TGV that ran from Paris to Lille and then on to Brussels and London, Amsterdam and Cologne. And there was a TGV that ran from Paris to, the Côte d'Azur, the south of France. Yeah. But if you wanted to get from Brussels to, Marseille or whatever, you had to traipse through Paris. You had to get off at the Gare du Nord, take the RER, which is what they call their regional commuter system, from Gare du Nord to the Gare de Lyon, and then get on a second train so that you could go to the south of France. It was just stupider than you can imagine. So eventually they built a TGV station out in Roissy, which was mainly designed to serve the airport, right, Charles de Gaulle. Mm-hmm. And then they also built one in Chessy-Marne-la-Vallée, which is where Euro Disney is. And they then built some spurs on the various lines that connected into Paris that went to and through those places. So now you could actually get from Brussels to Marseille without having to change trains in Paris.
Even when we were chatting before, you had talked about living in Belgium, living in Italy, living in England. Where are you now, and what other countries have you lived in? It sounds like that probably might not be the end of the list.
So at the moment, I live in a place that I've just moved to, in just about 2 months ago, which is St. Petersburg, Florida. I had a whole slew of reasons for wanting to move here, but it has to be said, getting away from Washington winters was kind of the primary thing that got me thinking about this. And then there were other reasons that came along afterwards, but at the moment, that's still a big consideration, So, but before that, I lived for just under 39 years in Northern Virginia, first Arlington, and then in the West End of Alexandria. So I worked as a contracting officer for 15 years at the Naval Air Systems Command. Spent a lot of time in Belgium, and not so much in France, but Belgium is to France sort of as Canada is to the United States.
Okay.
On the one hand, they resent them, and on the other hand, they want to be them.
And it's very close. The time I went to France, we flew into Brussels, and you're in France within an hour. It's like it's not.
Oh, yeah.
It's very
Hell,
close.
these days you're in Paris within an hour, thanks to the TGV.
Yep.
It's an hour and 15 minutes door to door.
Not by Otto, the bus driver.
I'm sorry?
Not with Otto, the bus driver. He takes back roads. He took a back road that he had to literally get out and go to the back of the bus, pop the little vent so he could peek out to see if he could get through the bridge. Like he literally.
Oh, goodness.
He did, by the way.
That's amazing.
He was insane, but
I'll bet.
he was half the trip right there. Like, one day I'll tell the story about taking the bus and going around the Arc de Triomphe. One of the previous students, because I went with culinary school, had told us, he's like, if you get the chance when you're in Paris, sit in the front of the bus because it's one of the, double-decker overhangs. So we sat up there, and he just throws this bus straight into the rondelle around the Arc de Triomphe, which is about 6 lanes. It's ridiculous. And he just like, boom, we come up the Champs-Élysées and then just right into traffic. And you're just like, whoa.
Has to be done.
It does.
I mean, and that's bad. You should try driving around in Rome sometime.
Oh, I can't imagine. Maybe in the future, but that was very fun to watch.
So David, was your time in Belgium the inspiration behind making 26 your first game?
To some degree. I mean, I would have liked to make a game about the Belgian railroads initially, but there wasn't a lot of material available at the time, although there was some. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of material, surprisingly, available about the French railroad system, which I was able to get a hold of. And plus, I mean, the French system was interesting because it was kind of a hybrid system, right? I mean, the French system started out basically as, a gazillion tiny railroads going from point A to point B, many of which never laid a single, yard of track. And then eventually there was a kind of consolidation. And this is all tied in, by the way, with the evolving political structure of France during this time frame. I mean, when the railroads started, they just put in the July monarchy, which is probably the most, and I use the term in the European sense, liberal, that is to say most, open free market and individualistic government France has ever had. And that lasted until 1948, when Louis Napoleon got himself elected as president and spent 3 years undermining the July monarchy until he got to declare himself emperor in 1851. So from 1830 to 1851, it was pretty much open season. Anybody can do whatever they like. And then roughly in 1851, a couple of years after, the French Parliament passed a law called the Loi Freycinet, after its author, Freycinet's law. And under this law, all of the existing companies were basically merged into 6 or 7 larger entities, which were what the British would call quangos. They were ostensibly private, but still largely under state supervision. So these companies, the way that worked was you bid to build a line from point A to point B, whatever the requirements were, and the guy who won the bid got to do that. And then in the course of doing so, he could underwrite his efforts by issuing bonds, which were guaranteed by the French government. And then at the end, the whole thing got settled up. So a little bit like, and not by coincidence, I should add, the way that we did the transcontinental in this country. In fact, not only was the transcontinental set up very much like the French railroads under the Loi Freycinet, but the same pathologies afflicted it actually under the same name, because the principals in France, as well as in this country, figured out that if they set up their own company to sell raw materials to the government supervised company, it was basically a license to print money. Yes. One hand washes the other. So, I'm sure, everybody who's interested in railroads in this country has heard of the Crédit Mobilier scandal. It is not a coincidence it's called the Crédit Mobilier scandal, or that the organization that perpetrated it was called the Crédit Mobilier, because it's basically a Chinese copy of what the French, some of the French principals had done in their own effort. All that came to an end, and when the dust is settled, the French had a pretty good, if entirely Paris-centric network. And I guess we should bear in mind that a lot of the lines that were built were not built with passengers or even commerce in mind. They were built for military purposes. The whole Eastern Railroad, right, the Chemin de Fer de l'Est, basically ran through territory which even to this day is very underpopulated. But it did so because it was the only way to get troops to the military frontier with Germany as quickly and efficiently as possible. So basically, you left Paris and you went through a couple of smaller cities, and then finally you got to Strasbourg, which is the next big city that was on the route.
Right.
So I mean, and I've taken those trains, both the old-fashioned trains and the new-fashioned trains. If you take an old-style train, what one of my American friends calls the train à grande paresse, the train of great laziness, to contrast with the train à grande vitesse, the train of great speed. It takes 5 hours.
The TGV.
5 hours to get from Paris to Strasbourg. And those trains don't exist anymore because they've been supplanted TGVs, which now make the run in like 2 hours. So it's much more efficacious. Yeah, much more efficacious. A bunch of companies operating more or less on a private basis, albeit heavily regulated. That went on until sometime in the 1880s when the West, which had an even more austere area in which it operated than the Est did, basically went broke, and the French set up the Chemin de Fer de l'État, the state railroad, which was largely built on the bones of the West. And that then the État became just a company. Fast forward to the 1930s, the Great Depression, all the companies are in trouble, and basically they all go bust. And in 1936, the French passed a law nationalizing them, but interestingly, only for a 99-year period.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let me read some titles to you. 1826, 18 EU, 18 Scan, 18 Florida, 18 Virginia, 18 Ardennes, 1836 Junior, 18 PA, 18 US, 18 West. I've played all of those except for 18 West. The pandemic makes it hard, but my friend Chad has a copy, so I will get it played. But that's 10 titles. Or I mean, I can't find another author that's been as prolific as you. Look, Mark Derrick's got 8, Lonnie Orgler's got 8, but some of those are co-authored. Like, you've just been this
it was
machine.
never my intent to be the most prolific 18XX author, but I seem to have slowly morphed into that. And now I guess, if there were a Guinness Book of World Records title, I would be able to claim it.
You just got to buy it. That's all fine. You can do it.
That's right.
Technically, it's only 9 published titles because 1836 Junior has never been formally published. Although, as I may have mentioned to you in our correspondence, there's a Polish group that has expressed interest in doing so. And We've had some correspondence, but to be honest, I haven't heard much from them lately, so I have no idea what's going on. The game is there. It's easy to make, because especially if you have a copy of 1830 that you can just pirate the pieces from. In fact, that was what it was originally designed as, right? It was designed to be, I'm not going to say it was a joke. It was not a joke, but it was sort of like in the spirit of 1876, right? The Trinidad game.
Yeah. Which
came actually in 2 versions as well, the 30 version and the 35 version, which had different rules, but which, basically followed the original game fairly closely. Obviously, they had specific rules that were specific to those games. And 1836 Junior was supposed to be like that. But be that as it may, so I started developing a game about Belgium, which actually was okay. It just wasn't very interesting. It was sort of, to use Tom's own phrase, a bit processional, right? Every game looked kind of the same as the last one because honestly, there weren't a lot of choices to make. And there was only so much that I was willing to play with in order to make the game, a truly playable game. I mean, we can come back to 1826 and talk about some of the compromises that I made in order to make that a playable game. But the point is that even at that level, I couldn't get 1836 set only in Belgium to be an interesting game. So then I expanded it and made it a game about Belgium and the Netherlands. And that actually was making some progress, but it still wasn't very interesting. So I just gave up on it.
Well, I was going to ask if you had any games in the pipeline. I like your games quite a bit, and so I'm waiting for the next David Hecht game.
Well, that may not happen for a while, if indeed it ever happens. I mean, game design is like any other form of creative activity. Niven was asked one time what it's like to write, and he said, "Oh, writing is really, really easy. You take your typewriter, you roll a sheet of paper into it, and then you stare at it until beads of blood appear on your forehead."
I hear you.
So game design is a little bit like that. It's a creative urge that is not easy to reify. You got all these ideas inside your head, but putting them down on paper is not easy. Turning the thing that's in your head into a thing that's on paper is no simple task, and people don't understand that. But the point is, you have this urge, you have this kind of thing that's going on that forces you to do it. And that pressure is what impels you, despite the difficulty and the general painful and unpleasant nature of the process, to press on.
Right.
And the reward, such as it is to see other people say, "This is my work. This is your work in which we are well pleased." It's not like I'm doing this because I want the plaudits of the crowd. I just want people to be happy. I want people to say, "Oh, this is cool. I like it," and to increase their happiness and to advance the hobby, right? Because we live in a niche hobby, which is frankly, even if anything, even more generational than wargaming is. And I worry that in 20 years, no one will play 18xx games anymore.
No, not at all.
I don't think that's a problem.
No, it
No,
is
fair
actually.
But the other thing is that the hobby goes through sort of phases and fashions, if you will. And of course, those phases and fashions are to some degree tied to the fact there's more and more designs available. Because as I mentioned earlier, back when I started this process in 1995, you could count the number of published designs on the fingers of two hands without using your thumbs. Nowadays, there's a prolixity of designs, and to be honest, most of them are kind of half finished. The people involved do not have the discipline to go through what it takes to make their designs really work. And I take pride in doing that. And some people do take pride in doing that. One of the things I'm so impressed by 1817 is, even though it is a game that I fundamentally do not care for all the obvious reasons that you can infer from the way my own designs are set up, it's a brilliant design. And it's a great effort on the part of Tim and the other guy's name is flown right out of my head, but you know what I'm talking about.
Craig Bartel is the other.
Thank you. Sorry, Craig, for forgetting your name. I'm embarrassed. And again, I don't mean to single him out because I have tremendous respect for him, and I do not in any way, shape, or form mean this deprecatingly, but Bruce Beard has come to be kind of the big dog in the ecology of 18xx gameplay, at least in the convention circuit that I'm aware of. And he really likes 1817 and games like 1817, and he's not a huge fan of games that are more operationally oriented, which is what most of mine are. And there's nothing wrong with that, any more than there's anything wrong with my saying, I like games like 18 West, but I don't like games like 1817. It's not meant as a knock on either the designers or the or the games to say you don't like them. It's just a matter of personal preference. So anyhow, so the point is that Bruce is one of those guys that if you're an 18xx gamer, you kind of want to be him, or at least be good enough to be considered in the same on the same playing field as him, because he really is a terrifically good player.
I've seen all his trophies. I know
Bruce casts a very long shadow, and as a result, everybody wants to be playing the games that Bruce likes because that's the only way they can really play Bruce, which is fine. But what it means is, it took me a long, long time to get these games to the point where I felt they were publishable. And the last game that I worked on, 18PA, I worked very, very hard on, and I got it to the point where I felt it was publishable. And much to my surprise, not only was it a pretty decent game, I thought, but in addition to that, I seem to have contrived to create a game that was actually playable in 3 hours. That was a decent game. Florida you can play in 3 hours, but let's face it, it's a bit processional. Not so much that you always do the same things, but that ultimately all the runs kind of look alike from one game to the next, because they have to. It's a string bean map, and that inexorably puts you in a situation where that's the way it has to be.
Yeah, you have to do these runs to get the payouts at the end. There's just
exactly.
Yep, makes sense.
So, I mean, it is more replayable than some other games that are designed for beginners, but only just. Let's put it that way. You know, it got published and sort of disappeared without so much as a ripple into the larger ecology of 18X games. It kind of took the wind a bit out of my sails, and I said, "Okay, we're gonna just put this on pause for a while." And now, 5 years later, we're still on pause.
I said we need to unpause you, so that
I guess.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing too is I'm sort of running out of brilliancies to commit. I mean, I have some other things that are kind of irons in the fire, but the main one that I would really like to get going is I started to design a game about the airlines that would have been based on the 18XX game system.
I'd like that.
Right?
I think that
I would
fun.
too, but I just can't make it work. You know, there's three good games are based on kind of a three-legged stool. You know, they have to be historically plausible, they have to be playable, and they have to be interesting. And a lot of games do very well on 2 out of the 3 and are a bit weak on the third.
I was going to say, let's get into some 26 details, man.
Yeah. Like we could spend all day doing this.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to let this degenerate into a game design clinic.
No, it's completely all right.
Design.
Yeah. So I will say this, David. I think we may have to have you back because, we are going to cover more of your games. I really like Ardennes. We just started playing 26. I obviously have Scan. So the opportunity exists for you to hold clinics many times in the future here. So you're completely
Fair
fine.
enough. No, I accept.
But so we kind of like to use 30 as kind of like a milepost, just to kind of give people an idea of how things interact a little bit. And I think with your designs, this one in specific, it kind of makes sense because the auction is very 30 style. Well, it isn't very 30 style. It is completely 30 style. And Tony put down that he likes that there are some privates in here that are a little more interesting. I think than other privates. We have like the mail contract style private, but you also have 2 shares of companies floating around there, which I think is a lot of fun. We have 10 companies, and this is one of the things, we'll get into this a little bit more in the stock round, but with the exception of one, we have everybody starts with a 5-share company and may have the opportunity at a later time to grow up. It's incremental cap. So you have to build your own companies from scratch. There's one exception, and that's the Belge. They started a 10-share, and I do want to ask you why that is, because I think that's very interesting. And then last but not least, it's just pretty much a standard 2D stock market. It's not too painful. The ledges are pretty close and early, and there's a yellow zone, although in our plays, I did see one stock that kind of hung out in yellow the whole time because it was feeding money to other companies. So I have seen a part. What's that?
Did that player win?
No, they were trying to combat me, and it didn't work in the end. But I think it was a good job to get money into other companies for them, and they were able to, just kept it right down there and just kept playing with it. That was actually Kelly in our last play. Awesome. So that's pretty much the long of the short. The track is pretty basic. You get 2 tile lays on your first one, and then it's one after that. So the map kind of explodes quickly early, and then kind of, I don't want to say stalls, but then progress is definitely slowed down. It's not nearly as blindingly fast as, some of the other games that let you lay 2. So that's pretty it. There's nothing too crazy with the track, as far as what's available and everything. Pretty standard upgrade paths all the way to gray for most of the companies.
Yeah, let me just kind of talk a little bit about what you've said and sort of explain a bit.
Sure. Give us some context.
At the time, and again, I just, not to belabor the point, but there was not a lot of other games to work off of. Mm-hmm. And for also 1826 was my first design. And so it's inherently more conservative than my designs got to be later when I was more confident, let's say, in my own skills. And plus, I mean, at the time, I didn't have the awareness that I was going to be able to get a lot of people involved in playtesting, especially people who were willing to, to push the system. Again, kind of in the VX4, VX5 OptiVal mode. You got to fly this thing until you break it, and then you might actually learn something. So 1826 is a very conservative design that was originally intended to be a kind of, refined, improved version of 1830 with some 1835 elements. And also there were a couple, obviously, of elements from 1856 and even from 1870. So, but I mean, that's it. That's basically what you were working with. And, recognizing there was 1829 and 1853, but as others have pointed out, fairly early on, the 18XX family tree kind of bifurcated into two major branches, one of which is the 1829 branch and one of which is the 1830 branch, right? So I placed myself firmly on the 1829 branch, and most of the modern the 1830 branch, and most of the modern designs are in fact on the 1830 branch. And in that sense, 1817 is something of a reversion to a much older sensibility. And the point that I'm trying to make is there are a lot of things that are fairly deliberately copied from 1830, including, as you point out, the auction and the tile mix. But in both those cases, I tried to take care of some things that had always been kind of irritating to me, which was in the case of the auction, I always felt it was stupid that the bottommost company had no power. So I gave it a power. Not a big thing, but it made it more than just I have to pay $20 to kick open the door to all these other things, right? And or francs in this case. The tile mix, I hated the fact that in 1830, one of the tactics was what I refer to as tile eating. I'm going to take this upgrade tile, which is only available in a 1Z, 2Z, kind of availability factor, and I'm going to place it in a way that does absolutely zilch for me, but keeps it out of the hands of somebody who really needs it. And I just thought that was stupid. So, well, obviously there's still some limitations in that vein. First of all, the fact that I'm using semi-strict upgrade rules takes a lot of that out, because you can't just lay a tile that you literally cannot use any of the new track just to use it. Also, I disliked specifically the idea of tile shortages in city upgrades. I always felt it was kind of ridiculous that the first three guys to pick off the number 63 tiles were the only guys who got to upgrade green cities to brown, and then everybody else just had to suck it up for the rest of the game. I just thought that was stupid. Now, it is possible to, as we discovered later on, if you're extremely judicious, it is actually possible to create a blocked position where you can never place great tiles. Because there's 8 cities where you can put the 63s on, and 3 of those later upgrade to gray. So if you put all of the brown cities on the green cities that don't upgrade to gray, in other words, not Brussels, not Lille, and not Lyon,
right,
you're stuck, because none of those other cities upgrade to gray, which means that none of those brown city tiles will ever re-enter the mix. So it does create some rather interesting phenomena if you really want to play that game. But I was okay with that because that's something you really had to work at. It wasn't just, I'll just take this tile that happens to be at the top of the stack and plonk it down somewhere where nobody can ever use it again.
Makes sense.
Something else you... the stock market. I really hated the fact that in 1830, that, and in 1856 for that matter, basically you spent the entire game crawling along the bottom. I just thought that was ridiculous. And in fact, I was originally going to use a one-dimensional stock market, but I got rid of it because that made that a little too easy. In fact, as I put it to somebody when I switched back to the 2D stock market, I said, I've now reinvented the 2D stock market, and I now understand much more clearly why it exists and the logic behind the ledges. Because in fact, the ledges make it so that if your stock price is low, there's a lot of action that can be taken, but if your stock price is high, much less.
Right.
And and of course I noticed that other players, most notably Bill Dixon, had come up with ever more complicated methods of trying to mitigate the big swings in stock price. And I just thought, okay, a couple of things we can just clear up here. First of all, we're going to take away stock churning and profit taking.
Right.
We're going to take away that business where somebody, buys a $100 share and then flogs it for 135. Not going to happen at my table. And the other thing is that the incremental funding means every time you buy somebody's share from the what I'll call, for one of the better term, the IO, right? The company treasury in this case, you're putting money in that guy's company. And in fact, to the extent that you want to avoid helping him, you should buy those shares earlier rather than later. But the problem, of course,
Right.
is, if you buy them early, then you're not buying other stuff that might be making more money for you. And, plus the other thing is that, you buy them at price X and then you sell them. And then some other guy says, okay, I'll buy it at X minus the delta that you've just reduced it to. Ha, ha, ha. So in fact, you're not only helping the guy who owns the company, you're helping everybody else at the table who now has access to the stock that you've quote unquote trashed. And plus, I like the incremental funding thing. I thought it was an elegant mechanism. And plus, it gave me an easy way to work the destinations in, right? Because as I think I mentioned earlier, I was trying to emulate the system where the French government basically told these guys, go thou and build from point A to point B, and you'll get a reward at the end. And that's the reward. The reward is you get 5 brand new shares. Now, admittedly, of course, that means your own profits are mitigated, but that sort of kind of indirectly reflects in my rationalization of it the fact that the French government is now going to take a closer look at what you're up to because you're now effectively a public company and they don't want any real hanky-panky going on. So you're not allowed to rip off the consumer quite as much as you used to.
So David, there's one thing I wanted to ask you about. I saw online some mention of a private company variant, but I can't find any details.
Oh, yeah. Well, people have been talking about this for a long time, and I actually was only aware of part of this private company variant, and the person who claims that I sanctioned it is talking through their hat, quite frankly, because, okay. I mean, the only time that I was ever approached on that subject, it was, a number of people said, wouldn't it be good if we swapped the Belge and the Algerian so that the Belge is now a $70 company and therefore you can't actually lose money on it. And I said, well, you still can't lose money on it because, anyhow, for the reasons that I outlined in my discussion, which I'm not going to bore the reader with, they can take it as an exercise. So there was that. And I said, and they said, well, we'd like to publish it as a variant. And I said, well, feel free to publish as a variant, but I do not consider it an official variant, and I hope you'll respect that, which apparently they must have completely misunderstood what I was saying because apparently, according to the text that you sent me, not only did I agree to it, but I agreed to some other thing, which I would never have agreed to at all, right. Which is the notion of having the Alsatian operate strictly on the presidency. I mean, it's nonsensical.
Right.
And the reason the Alsatian, awesome. The reason the Alsatian is in the mix as a private company is so that I can get the Alsatian's presidency into play and get people to open up the company for a relatively modest sum and get that part of the board developed. Because as you've no doubt observed, France is a few really rich areas, France and Belgium, is a few really rich areas punctuated by an enormous amount of empty space. This is not the original map. There used to be 2 more map panels south of where Lyon is that took you all the way down to the actual Mediterranean.
Oh my gosh.
As we discovered in like the first 2 plays that made, the GC and the MIDI completely unplayable as companies because it took them forever to get to any place. And once they were there was still no place because everybody knew that it was about Paris and Belgium. Yep. So basically I just sliced off those 2 bottom map panels, which was a good thing anyhow, because it meant that the map was now much more manageable, and turned all those things into off-map areas.
So I think we're just going to kind of breeze, as Tony suggested there in the middle, if you caught it, we're just going to go straight into our yellow here, because our yellow phase is when we like to discuss the map and the stock market. So,
I'm terribly sorry. Yes, I didn't mean to.
No, you're completely fine. I'd rather have the stream of consciousness in any event. We kind of covered the stock market, and I pulled up the map for viewers at home, just so that they can see what we were talking about, the Alsace, and I outlined it over at G19. It's kind of out here in Strasbourg. So I think it makes total sense that you want to kind of have people open that side of the map. Otherwise, everybody will just grab all the Paris companies and just start running out of Paris, which means the whole southeast side of the map is just so slow to open. So, yeah, that makes total sense to me.
And in retrospect, you have to bear in mind this is because I lacked either the creative imagination or the confidence, or possibly both, to come up with a more creative solution. I mean, you'll observe, for example, in Ardennes, where there's a similar situation trying to give the Est something to do other than plot its way through a bunch of empty space. I, in fact, bring in a special rule that makes the military dimension much more apparent, right? With the forts.
Gotcha.
And the bonuses you get for building the forts.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I played Ardennes. It was one of the earliest games I played, so I definitely need to get that back to the table. Or somebody else's copy, I should say.
Well, I like the 1826 map. I find it to be unbalanced, of course, right? Which is what it is. And in reality, you just mentioned, the North is rich, but I also find it a lot of fun because of those imbalances in the map and, making the right decisions and who to invest in and what companies you can get started.
Absolutely.
If you see like the walls behind me, David, I like military history.
Yeah.
And so like looking at these maps is kind of like, the generals would approach a battlefield, right? Like, okay, where are the woods? Where are the hills? Okay, where's the cities with the, so I enjoy studying, I like maps in general, first of all, right? But I enjoy studying the maps to games that I'm being introduced to and trying to figure out, how the maps work. And this is one of the fun maps for me. That's,
it's
just
also
very simply.
It's one of the first maps I've ever encountered that kind of has an area that's blocked off until it's not. So you have Belgium. Yeah, you have Belgium kind of not the Maginot Line.
That doesn't come up all that often among seasoned players.
Yeah, no.
I mean, the Bells is just too good.
Yeah. It happened in our game. I started the Nord, which is the North Paris, and it got up to the end because somebody else started the other one out of Paris, and I had to wait one turn essentially before I could get a route done. Yeah. So it does rear its head, but not for very long. But it's interesting because if somebody tries to sit on the Belge, I could see that, but you're right. There's no reason to sit on the Belge.
Yeah, it just makes too much money.
And I've seen where the Belge could a ton of trains.
Well, it's like this famous story that I heard from Steve Thomas about Francis Tresham in 1856. He said, apparently, I thought 1856 was a very nice game until I saw it properly played. Because, Tresham's idea was the loans are just there to tide you over and you pay them off as quickly as you can. And you basically try and run your companies and blah, 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 blah. Whereas, in fact, as everyone knows who's actually played the game more than a couple of times or against seasoned players, the first thing you do when it's your company's turn to operate is you take out a loan. And then you decide if you can do something useful with the amount of money that you now have in your treasury.
I've seen the Belge president consider laying mean track south of Lille and cutting off the Nord.
Oh yeah, broad curve and a sharp curve to keep the. And I've seen games in which the Nord operated first and laid its two tiles.
And then gets whacked.
The broad curve and the straight, and then blammo, the Belge gets in its way, and the Nord is now boned until green phase.
Have fun with that.
But I'll tell you, the Nord. I ran the Nord, and I was ahead of the Belge for the entire game. So I always got to dictate, and pretty much everywhere the Belge had a token, I did, so it wasn't a problem. But the Nord was rich. It just kept whatever is competing up there with the Belge kind of needs to be in front of it, I think, to really be effective.
Yep. No. Well, it depends on the.
Or you have to make a deal, which is the way it usually works in the games that I've seen.
Right.
Tony, do you have anything else on the map? Because I think we've already covered this and we've talked about a lot of
Let's
map
talk
stuff.
about some trains.
Yeah. So we did talk about the Paris. I'm going to leave the map up because I think there's a piece that will be pertinent to trains. So
absolutely.
Yeah, we're going to enter into the green phase, which we like to talk about the train roster and everything that's on offer. Tony, I'm going to let you kind of take point because you, as a person, love the Hecht train. So I'll let you explain and chat.
Yeah, I do like Hecht
To be
trains. Right?
clear, they're not Hecht's trains.
Hmm?
They're Villani's trains.
You got me for a second
Sorry.
there.
Well done. Well done. I didn't know where that was going for a minute, and then I'm like, oh, wait a second, I get it now.
Like, what are you talking about, David? Hex trains are my favorite kind of trains, just, irrationally, because I know it's a game mechanic, like a 2-train, a 3-train, a 4-train. I just feel like Hex trains better, meet my mentality of this is how far this train can run,
Well, I like the Hex trains because they're the only kind of train that you can plausibly have as a 1 train.
That's correct.
and in fact, in Federico's game where they first appeared, which was 1827 Junior, he used 1H trains as the very first train class.
Yeah,
kind of like
so
a loco.
why?
I'm sorry.
Why is it a 1H when it could serve 2 hexes? I don't know. That kind of blows my mind. But,
you're the war gamer. You should know. It's about range,
movement.
Not about hexes.
It's right. It's right. It's about movement allowance.
Exactamundo.
Cool. I really like, David, the implementation of the E-trains in the game, how they become better as more E-trains come in because the tracks are getting more electrified, and then the TGVs come in and kind of shut that down.
That one I kind of get to take credit for.
Good.
Because originally the way this was set up was the electrification was based on a series of little tokens that had basically catenary poles on them, right? And just illustratively, and each turn you could place a certain number of these. You had to pay for them, of course, and by doing so, you increased the routes over which the E-trains could run.
Right.
Right. That was the principle involved, but it became so complicated and so annoying. And so, I mean, the only that a friend of mine actually, who I used to play these games with, and indeed played a lot of other games with when we were in college together, said, "What about if you just increase the range of the trains, depending on how many companies own them?" Which that was his original thinking, was that each company is kind of contributing to this effort, and if they have one of these things, they have an impetus to make it happen. So therefore, each time you would make the trains better, and then we had to abstract that to make them all better, because keeping track of which ones were improved and which ones weren't was ridiculous. So we weren't going to do that. And of course, they're much, much better than the H trains, because the H trains are, for the most part, either the 6Hs, which are basically pre-war trains, still staggering along after the occupation and the liberation, and then of course the 10Hs, which were generously provided by our country and Canada and some other places to the French to replace the inventory which the Germans had either looted or which had gotten bombed to smithereens by us. And as the story of that is told on the legend that's on the cover, the 10H is in fact the liberation locomotive. Despite the glamour of steam trains of fond memory, traveling by steam train was not a pleasant exercise. Also, the French were trying to get away from steam, because steam in those days at least required coal, and the French did not have a lot of coal. One of the peculiarities, in fact, one of the reasons I suspect that France was not at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution is because they have very little coal as compared to, for example, the British, who were basically sitting on mountains of it. So the French were trying to get away from coal because they basically had to import a lot of the coal that they were using. And in fact, the last of the liberation engines to go out of business were powered by fuel oil. They'd converted the engine so that it would take oil instead of gasoline instead of rather than coal, because A, was a lot cleaner. I mean, I know that in these days of modern times, oil is not considered a clean burning fuel, but in those days,
it's still a lot cleaner than coal.
Compared to coal, it was pretty darn clean. And so it went. So in fact, the French actually never went through a diesel phase. They went straight to electric. And that was partially because of the war.
Okay.
I mean, the French and the Belgians are enormous contributors to to railroad technology. Most people in the English-speaking world at least aren't aware of this, but it's the truth. You can look it up. In fact, if you look at the money from the Chris Lawson edition of 1826, you will observe that most of the figures that are represented there are in fact French and Belgian. In fact, I believe they're all French and Belgian, but a couple of them are, people who are not actually engineers. But those that are engineers are all French and Belgian, and every one of them has something that's named after him. Anyhow, so back to the topic at hand. The electric trains. The electric trains were originally intended to be a sort of slow progression, but the problem was that it didn't work out quite that simply. I mean, at the beginning, there was a fixed number of E-trains, which was 5. And that worked, and that worked out fine because it changed the number that came out depending on how many companies survived the SNCF.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But what we discovered at one point was that there were too many of them for the companies that were left alive, and so you could never break through to the TGVs, which meant you could never crack open the gray tiles or the final values on the off-map areas. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I did not care for it, so eventually we made the number variable, and that unfortunately had the effect of meaning that basically you went all the way through to the TGVs in fairly short order. Because the number that's there is designed, the number that's provided is intended to make sure that the number of companies that are left will allow you to crack open the TGVs no matter what. Right. Won't necessarily force you to, but it will allow you to.
Yes.
So there's that.
And on the TGV front, having those guys being able to run the same track, you can and double, you can make some serious money.
Oh yeah. Well, part of that was because I thought TGVs were important, and having learned my lesson about the the extra track laying from dealing with the electric trains, I said, okay, the reality is in real life, the French do not reuse track for the TGV. That's just a fact. They build a brand new track that's designed for the purpose and correctly, banked and, set up so that you can whiz along it at 300 clicks, 160 miles an hour, which was a good 50 to 60% faster than any steam train has ever operated. So is a lot, or diesel for that matter. So is a lot. I mean, the only train that has ever operated that fast that is not electrified like the TGV's turbo train, which was a design by GM, I believe, that came out in the early 70s in this country, which was basically a gas turbine propelled train. Made perfect sense in an era when oil was cheap.
Right.
Because, as you're probably aware, gas turbines are gigantic gobblers of fuel.
I'm waiting for nuclear-powered trains.
That would be nice. I'm sure that somebody somewhere had an idea for that. I mean, heck, we had nuclear-powered airplanes on the drawing board at one point.
Yeah.
Even when I was working for the Navy, there was an idea of creating what we would have called in the old days dirigibles, airships. That would have been nuclear powered.
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
Because, a lot of what the Navy cares about in aircraft is endurance.
Right.
I mean, speed and maneuverability are a big deal. But, if you're talking about airborne early warning or, tankers or
AWACS
electronic
or
warfare
like that,
or, all sorts of things like that, what you really want is endurance. So the idea was to convert things like get rid of the P3 and the KA-6D and the E-2C and all those other aircraft of that type and replace them with airships. Obviously, they'd have essentially indefinite insurance. And in order to preclude them from running out of gas, the idea was to put a nuclear power plant in them. Because, they were big. They were like submarines, right? They were gigantic. And so you could put the nuclear power plant far away from where the crew was and not have to worry about, going in the dark Navy people as the submariners sometimes jokingly refer to themselves. Unfortunately, it got to be very expensive and they eventually just decided it wasn't a good idea.
So one of the interesting things that I find on the map that you did, and not a lot of people do this, and I wanted to ask about it while we're on trains, is the offboard values and how they are based on the actual train itself instead of just saying, oh, and thank you for not color coding them because that would drive me nuts. I know that would be a big pet peeve of Tony's too, because, the 2 to 6H, have value A, and then the 10H, the E, and the TGV could trigger the progression. Was there a what was the specific reason for that? Because I know you have to have one.
To be honest, it was mostly just about thinking about what the trains should be able to do in the absence of actual cities. I mean, it's not hugely different from the way it is in other games. I mean, in 1830, there's a yellow value, a green value, and I forget, is there a brown value or a diesel? One of the games has 4 values with the diesel values separate. I can't remember which it is.
Well, 89 does that.
Yeah, that's probably what I was thinking of. But anyhow, so I mean, the point is that I always knew I was going to have multiple values for the off-map areas, and I just decided to tie them to the trains themselves rather than color coding them by phase. Although in subsequent games, I have done some of both. I mean, if you look at 18 US, you'll see there's a couple where there's an obvious overlap because people were complaining that they wanted the color coding. So you guys weren't around to gainsay them, and so color coding it was.
Well, I like color coding it when it's appropriate, but if you're color coding something that's out of sync with phase, that's a big no-no to me. Like, you don't do that because it's just confusing.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. But I mean, and I don't have the map in front of me to be reminded of what the color codes actually say. But obviously, the TGV cracks open the gray phase, and the 10H cracks open the brown phase. So in that sense, it wouldn't be hugely different.
So speaking of brown phase,
yeah, you ready to move on to talking about some shenanigans in a shenanigan-rich environment that is 26?
Well, hopefully there won't be too much to talk about because, as I said to you in my correspondence, I deliberately tried to create a shenanigans-free game. I thought about it a little more afterwards, and I thought, maybe that point that can't remember his name now. There's a German designer. Who was forever talking about how his game would be the best game ever, except that, as far as I'm aware, it's never actually been published. I can't remember his name. It's not important. Anyhow, the point is that he used to talk about shenanigans, but basically what he said was every 18xx game has the same, to use a more modern term, narrative, which is you start small, you get big, and you start in a way that's guaranteed to put you in a hole at some point, and then you have to have a mechanism to let people claw their way out of the hole. So in 1830, it's the company ripping, and in 1856, it's the Canadian, and blah blah blah. So in my case, it's the loan structure basically, plus the two merger companies. I mean, what I really hated was the idea of games that ended in bankruptcies.
Okay.
Which is the main reason, by the way, that I really prefer to avoid using 1830 as a training game, because if you're playing against good players, inevitably the game is going to end up in a bankruptcy, and almost certainly the bankrupt player will be the new guy, which means he will never play another 18xx game ever.
Yeah. Well, I don't think 26 is a shenanigan-rich environment. It's and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
That I'm going to talk about in the great phase a little bit. The
closest thing that there is to shenanigans is a technique that Stephen Webb came up with during playtesting, which he actually thought was so powerful that he suggested that we nerf it, but I decided to leave it in as a strategy. And I'm not going to unpack it completely for you, but suffice it to say, it involves securing loans in the 4H phase.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's the shenanigan that I feel is because this is about the right trains and the right companies at the right times, right? That's what I feel like 26 is about.
Absolutely. In fact, I maybe even said that at some point.
Yeah, without crazy rules, right? To briefcase and all these kind of things. So, but I think the shenanigan is involving those national companies, right? Putting something in there on purpose, perhaps one thing, maybe it's got a loan on it, those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, but it has to be said that there is, unlike in, say, 1856, where that's kind of integral to your strategy, in 1826, much less so. Right. I mean, the truth is, once you start going down that path, it's kind of a counsel of desperation. But what is true is that, and 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 I try to keep the national companies from being a source of shenanigans too, by forcing them to buy and sell trains at face value.
Exactly.
And indeed, even with companies, also with companies that have loans,
Right.
Yeah.
Because that proved to be a little too good at the beginning, where they, some guy would form the SNCF and then he'd buy all the 6 trains that he had left on his other companies, and the SNCF was left with 3 6 trains and nothing else. Which was very inconvenient for the next person in line, because of course the SNCF had a single share presidency, which meant that if any player at the table had a share of SNCF and you ran ahead of them, boom.
Gone. Yeah, for sure. And that's
good.
So
I had to quickly intervene to fix that up.
So a friend of mine who's been playing these games for quite a long time, I like to say he's been playing them since 1829. And I mean the game, not the year. But he is an elderly gentleman. He said to me, he's like, I've played. So David, I've played 1826 9 times. He's played it far more than that. He says he can't recall an instance where the État was formed. And I was going to ask you, is that a shenanigan that is not a shenanigan? The shenanigan that never was? But then in Chris's game, the original
thinking was, again, this is where history and playability kind of come into conflict. At the origin, I think I mentioned earlier that the original État in real life was built on the bones of the West. So in the original version of that rule, if any company was left trainless except the Belge, the État formed. But that just proved to be way too punitive. So I made it 2 companies or more. Right. So now you kind of have to work at it. And in fact, I've known people that did work at it.
Yeah.
Okay.
They wanted to form the État, but the trick is the État is only good if you can get it to run in the first op round after it forms. Because if you don't get enough shares out there, you're just hosed.
Right, because you now lose. And that's exactly what happened, right? Like the État was used it was borderline weaponized, because the person who ended up buying all the trains to trigger the État form also wiped out 2 companies. He happened to own the Belge and gobbled up, he was able to get a little more company money than anybody anticipated from a hold, because he was running so rich. And then he formed it, and then 2 companies just instantly went into the État while we're sitting on going into round 2. It couldn't run that round because its miners already ran, or one of them ran. So it got like doubly hosed for that second person. And then the other person had an odd share, so they lost a complete share to nothing. So it was just kind of this whole cascade. Needless to say, I did not have a company go into it. And once I saw that happen later in the game, I gobbled up the trains in order to make the Nord trigger the formation of the SNCF. So that, and then weaponized it. But I was also able to sell it down to like 2 shares, and then somebody else bought it up. So I didn't really lose anything in the end. And it just felt like really good to do it too, I have to say, because I'm like, it's going to happen. And right at the beginning, and then I was able to start another company and kind of offload I think I had the Est that I didn't really care about, because it kind of already built all the track the Nord wanted. And then off it goes. And it worked out really well. It's being able to control the train rush, but here you're also could potentially control company loss and like what gets gobbled up. So that was a really fun tactic.
Well, the trick with both the SNCF and the État, if you wind up forming it, is it's very much like the 1856 thing. The GCR is a super company once it's formed, but you really don't want to lose all that stock value that you would lose by putting companies into it, to the extent that you can avoid it. So the trick is, wait for somebody else to form it and then pick up the pieces, kind of thing.
Right.
Not
Then
necessarily
by
somebody else but I mean somebody else to be to be in command. Try and figure out a way to ditch as many of your, which I mean is the normal tactic anyhow, right? I mean, you've loaded up your company with 6 or 7 loan markers. You've extracted as much cash from it as you can. It's all good, right?
Yeah, I mean, nothing went in with loans, but it was definitely like the second one, the SNCF actually was going. It ended up with like $1,200. Like it was no chump, and it had some decent track, but it's still. I think the share value hit. That. Yeah, the share value really hurt.
You have to make sure and flush your treasury stock in advance, or else you're really giving the guy who gets it a ridiculously good deal.
Yeah, I think I actually saw a game in which
a guy bought. I want to say he bought 3 trains on his first OR, right? A 10H and I forget a 10H and E, and I forget whether the third train was an E or a second 10H. But the point was, he made it into a monster, and the rest of us just said, "Okay, we're Villani made an interesting observation to me during the playtesting phase, because he obviously made the same observation. The ETA rarely, if ever, forms, but the SNCF almost invariably does. This is back in the phase where, anyhow, I'm not going to, sorry. So he said, what's up with the ETA? It never seems to form. And I said, well, it nevertheless serves an important function, because it's always there looming over people's shoulders when they're deciding what to do about going to their destination or increasing their revenue. Right? Because, I mean, the Alsace is a perfect example. If you build that first dot town south so that it goes into Basel, just like it did in real life, well, you're kind of boned, because you cannot possibly get to Lyon in time to stave off death if you do that. And since none of these companies run all that well with a single 2 train, right. I mean, I don't know how it's going in your 9 games or however many games you've played, but I rarely, if ever, see anybody buy other than a pair of 2H trains on the first turn, with the exception of the Belgian, which usually buys 3.
Yeah, and that's a key point to just kind of bring up. So, there were a lot of companies that were sitting out there train tight with 2Hs on them. So when the ETA formed, they rust, which now leaves them to go in. So when you buy that 4H, if you didn't get to destinate and grow up and you didn't see it coming, you'll get completely caught off guard. So, which again, you're right. It's looming out there saying you have a reason to destinate, so you have potential not to get gobbled up. Exactly.
Right. So, I mean, I guess that's really the thing, is that the ETA is there to remind people that doing stupid stuff gets you killed. Or as Federico put it, it's like nuclear weapons. Once they start flying, you've lost anyhow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think you're right, Tony. I think, and that's a good thing. Like, stock trashing isn't hugely beneficial to, somebody else. There's not a ton of other shenanigans. There's just it's just operational, right? Like occasionally you can, keep somebody out of London for, a good chunk of the game if you want those northern routes. The track lays, you could be a little jerky about it if you really want, but other than that, that's really it. Like there's not a ton, but playing with these what do I want to say? These country-owned companies, I think the government-owned companies, I think that's where it gets a little interesting. So have some fun with that.
For what it's worth, the one place where you really can bone somebody with bad track lays is Milan.
Okay.
The lower southeastern corner of the map, because it's basically almost entirely surrounded by cities, and so tokening action is a big issue. And even if you manage to sneak in that one place that there isn't a city, there's only a limited number of tiles that will allow you to get in there, and it so happens that one of those is a tile that can get used up quite inadvertently by the people upgrading, places in the north.
Right.
It's the dot town that's straight with a with a turn that in that particular orientation would take it off to the north.
And getting
northwest, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, and getting back to a little bit with the tile and the hex train and everything, one thing that's kind of a side benefit I like is that you don't have people being able to build monster bypasses, because you can't just gobble up track just to make a loop run. Like, just because the West wants to go north, and has to take the whole southern route to do it, that's just not realistic. It needs to actually go north. Otherwise, it's wasting so much of its run just covering ground and pounding sand. So
no question about it. Mostly the only bypasses that I see are if for whatever reason someone has built a Dijon and on a Paris to Lyon run, which often happens if those companies open in the green phase.
Right.
And then people often bypass Dijon by upgrading the two tiles to its immediate west and southwest.
Yep. Had a wonderful lunch at Dijon, just saying. All right.
Did you have some mustard to go with?
What do you think? Of course I did. Brought some home, even a nice little crock.
I'm glad David had the brain.
But I got news for you though. There, they just call it mustard. They don't call it Dijon.
Well, that's like the old joke. I think I told you that the French like to rag on the Belgians. In Belgium, what the French call baguette is referred to as pain français, French bread.
There you go.
And so the joke goes: some Belgian goes to the south of France to take his holiday, and the first day he goes down to the boulangerie, to the bread shop to buy his bread for the week or the day, and he walks in and he asks the man behind the counter, un pain français, s'il vous plaît, French bread, please. And the man looks at him in indignation and says, tous nos pains sont français, monsieur. All of our breads are French, sir.
Nice.
So I imagine the same thing in Dijon. Yeah, could I have some Dijon mustard? All of our mustard is Dijon, sir.
Exactly. So let's bring up the gray phase. The gray phase is when we like to talk about just general feels and summation about the game itself, how it gives us the happies. Because generally speaking, if we're talking about a game, we're generally happy about it. So we're not gonna we don't play things we don't like, and I don't think you're interested in hearing that anyway, but you might be.
I mean, if they're legitimate criticisms, I'm always open for them. But it has to be said, after 20 years in the wild and 25 years since I first started developing it, I would be surprised to hear any specific complaint that I haven't already addressed at some point.
There you go. And to that note, I also, right before we hopped on, I'm like, you know what? I better go order it from Deep Thought real quick before we cause the rush. So we call it the wheel tapping effect, right? You might sell 3 copies, so I got to get in the head of the queue. So Tony, I usually let you go first, but I'm just going to jump in and take the first run this time, because my feels are very, very at the surface, and we'll let your thoughts kind of linger a little bit longer. So I really enjoyed it. Tony introduced this to me a couple months ago, and I had a blast. I already knew I was predisposed to like it because I do like David's games as a rule, David. Your games kind of sit right in my brain space, and I really enjoy that. So this one is a great school night game. We get it played in, around 3 hours in that mark. It was, in that time frame. But I love that there's a lot going on that you can still play with, and a lot of interesting little strategies and companies you start and things like that. I felt very clever when I pulled off the SNCF coup, and the fact that I was able to get both of the available 10H trains in my company just made me feel like I was the smartest guy on earth for about 10 minutes.
Wow. The 2 available trains must have been a bloodbath out there.
It turned into one shortly after that. Because
arguably, if there were only 2 NH trains, that means 3 of them fell off because at least 3 companies fell off. Yeah,
exactly.
Ta ate a couple early.
It did. And
of course, I hadn't even thought about that.
And I would argue that 10H is the best trade in the game for revenue.
It is the best trade in the game.
Absolutely. So to be able to do that felt, able to see it coming and be able to plan ahead. I really like it. Any game that gives you those clever moments and you feel like you're leveraging the game mechanics to do it. I just love that opportunity. And I don't always get to feel that way in a lot of 18xx games. That I enjoy them, sure, but I don't ever get to feel like super clever or smart, or I really pulled this thing off, where like I did when I won that game Monday. So yeah, you get 26 thumbs up from me. So well done. Tony.
Well, congratulations on winning, and thank you for the kind words. I mean, as I say, this is my first design, and as such, it is more recognizable as kind of a mainstream 1830 branch 18xx than pretty much anything that I've done subsequent to it. It's the only game that uses traditional track, right?
Okay.
Yep.
All the other games use the Lawson track.
Yeah.
And which I like much better. And frankly, if it had been around when I was designing 1826, there's a decent chance I would have given it a shot as well.
Okay.
Which again is in part because, I mean, Chris's point, I mean, he invented this track for the game that he calls 1848, which now has some completely different number because there's at least two other games out there that have pinched the 1848 nomenclature from him. But his point is, at this scale, switches and bypasses and overpasses make no sense.
Gotcha.
Right? I mean, the logic of the situation is that you're operating at a very high scale and all that stuff is lost to the noise level. So and I accept that. So unless you're developing some game that's really super local, which I might yet do, because I thought it'd be interesting to make a game about the development of the transportation networks around New York City and northern New Jersey. Right? The idea being, obviously, that, as you're well aware, the railroads from the south did not cross the Hudson River until the early 1900s. They were the Hudson, as you may or may not be aware, is a sunken valley. It's a product of elastic glaciation, so it's incredibly deep, and it's made out of stone. So trying to build a tunnel under it is nearly impossible, and trying to build a tunnel on the bottom is not quite impossible, but it's certainly problematic if you're dealing with the technologies of the 19th century. So they finally managed to do it, but up until that point, the way that it worked was, you basically got off the train in Weehawken or Jersey City or someplace like that, and then you got on a ferry, and that took you across to Manhattan. But anyhow, so I'm thinking about developing a game in that area, and that for that game, the traditional track might actually be appropriate because the scale would be very, very small.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool. So Tony, what's your feels? Let's have it.
So with 1826, I kind of got three bullet points to go over here. The first one being,
I picked the middle one.
What's that, sir?
I said I picked the middle option. It's a joke about PowerPoint that was actually originally illustrated by Norman Augustine way before there was such a thing as PowerPoint. He said that when he was Undersecretary of the Army, some general brought him the complaint that he wanted to add an additional option to a briefing that was going up to the secretary. And Augustine said, I found this really puzzling, considering that one of the two available options was in fact the general's preferred option, until the general finally blurted out in a moment of exasperation, but Mr. Undersecretary, you know that the secretary always picks the middle option.
Well, sir, you're going to get
sorry. Didn't mean to hijack your point.
You're going to get all three options. My friend Nick, who, by the way, said to tell you hello. You guys have been corresponding in email, I guess, recently.
Oh, yeah.
Nick is he's one of my best friends, and I met him going on 2 years ago. Just randomly on the internet, he reached out to me to say, I would like to learn how to play 18xx games. I hear you like to teach. I live, an hour and a half away. I'm willing to drive to Denver and be taught. And I said, well, first thing I told him was, well, We do occasionally imbibe an adult beverage. We will occasionally crack off a swear word, and we do like to talk trash to each other, all in good fun, of course, at the table. And so he said all those things were fine with him. He sent me a picture of his fridge full of beer, that kind of stuff. And so I said, all right, we're actually playing 1826 this Saturday. Not necessarily a beginner game, but if you want to get into it with us, come on. And he said, no problem. So he came down, and he was our fifth player. It was a 5-player game of 26 that Saturday. And kind of the rest is history. He fell in love with 18XX. He fell in love with 1826, still one of his favorites. He got tossed right into the fire. And kind of on a side note, furthers my belief that really in the right environment, any game can be a teaching game. So 26 has played a role in bringing someone who I consider to be one of my best friends into my life.
Well, excellent, outstanding.
It's just one of my favorite 18XX games of all time. As we mentioned earlier, Chris likes operational games. I like operational games, as well as stock miniature. I like the whole gamut, really. But one of the things I appreciate about operational games, and 1826, definitely dials this in, is like it creates an environment for competitive play, right? Where my planning, my execution, my ability to try to manipulate the timings of the game rather than the rules of the game is what determines victory. And I really, really like that.
Yeah, you actually raised kind of an important point, which I probably should have mentioned. Well, it's less of an issue in 18XX than many others, but due to the basic nature of the system. But game design also requires you to balance, king of the hill with crabs in a bucket. You don't. On the one hand, you don't want to create a situation where a runaway leader cannot be stopped, but on the other hand, you also want to create a situation whereby everybody else ganging up on him, they can never be a leader. That any time anybody gets even the slightest bit ahead, they get pulled down by everybody else.
Right.
And 18XX works well that way because it is sufficiently interactive that you can slow people down, but not so interactive that you can basically just annihilate their position,
Exactly.
If they're not paying attention. I mean, you can mess them up pretty bad if you drop a bunch of dead companies on them, but that's about the worst that can happen. And yeah, I think it's safe to say that nobody goes through that regimen more than once before they wise up to it.
Only by one.
Yep.
The last bullet point, David, is just a thank you. I first met you actually one time back in Chattanooga of 2017. You and John and Jeanette had just got done playing something, and I just said, hey, thanks. That's actually where I acquired my copy of 1826, was delivered to Chattanooga. And I'm
embarrassed to say that I have no recollection of having met you. I am very, very sorry.
Why would you? I'm just a random, goofball that just
complete
said,
rando.
Hey, thanks. This is an opportunity to reiterate that thanks, not only for 26, but your other games. A lot of hours of fun at the table. And if I could take it back to something you said earlier today, I'll slightly change what you said. I will say that 1826 is your work in which I am well pleased.
There you go.
You're very, very kind to say so, and I'm humbled by your praise.
There you go. Well, we like to finish up with our priority deal marker, and I attempted to make mine because now I have a 3D printer and it failed, so I didn't get to print mine. But mine was
getting a little tin Eiffel Tower is not that hard to do.
Nope. So that's exactly.
Although personally, although the Eiffel Tower is cool, it's become such a cliche that as you've no doubt observed in the game itself, I tend to use other symbology to represent France, like the Arc de Triomphe.
So yeah, I was going to say, if you were reprinting this today and you could put whatever you wanted in the box, what would it be?
For a priority deal?
Yeah.
For a priority deal. Well, let's think about that. I'd be sorely tempted to put, the Waterloo Monument, just as a subtle indication of where my loyalties really stand. But I might not get away with that. So, but if I wanted to put in something that's specifically French, I don't know. I might put in Notre Dame just as a
There you go.
a way of reflecting that it's a national treasure that has sadly been eviscerated by a tragic accident, and hopefully will be restored. But in the meantime, we hold it dear in our hearts.
There you go. You know what
Well,
I
this
picture? I picked. Yeah, that works.
It's like $3 on Amazon.
There you go. Well, this has been a blast, David. I'm so glad we were able to connect and get to chat and
It was
provide.
fun.
Yeah, this was great. Like I should stop being surprised at how much intent and research goes into designing these games, but I continue to be surprised at just the depth of accuracy that you go to, and being able to balance that with the actual gameplay itself. I think it's a monumental challenge, and thank you for knocking it out of the park yet again. So
You're most kind, and I thank you again, and I thank you for the opportunity. It's not every day I get to speak to such cheerful people as you. And I mean, it's fun. It was fun, and I hope, pursuant to what you said earlier, that we'll have another opportunity. And I hope that I didn't take up too much of the oxygen in the room.
All good. It's all good.
Talk about.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
You're most welcome. Peace and grace. Hope it all comes out the way you want it to. And again, keep in touch. And I'd be more than happy to do this again with. Really any of my other games, obviously including PA. But yeah.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Yep.
Sir.
Thank you so much.
Right.
And thank you at home for watching. And we'll see you next time on Wheel Tapping. There you go.
Be well, gentlemen. Cheers.
Wheel Tapping is brought to you by Game Toppers. Upgrade your next experience with a great Game Topper or Matt from Game Toppers. Check them out at GameToppersLLC.com. A quick thank you to all the patrons and people who support the show by sharing it. Thank you for your support, and we appreciate everything you do to keep the show going.
Punchboard Media, where we all
Bring something
to the table.
pull up a chair.